I will introduce Keel Dietz, who is a policy consultant for Myanmar at Global Witness. He's a PhD candidate at the Alperovitch Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And there he studies, his research rather focuses on Chinese foreign policy and authoritarian control of the internet. Keel has also experience of working even at the present as a Myanmar policy consultant for Global Witness. At Global Witness, he has previously co-authored reports on the intersection of jade mining and conflict in Myanmar, as well as on beneficial ownership reform. So I would now turn to Keel Dietz to give him the floor, and then we have a questions and answers and the discussions with all the three of you, I hope. So Keel, please.
Great, thank you so much, Chairwoman Hautala, and to the APHR and this International Parliamentary Inquiry for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone, depending on where in the world you are. Before I start, I would just like to introduce Global Witness briefly. We're an investigative anti-corruption organization, and in Myanmar, we've spent decades exposing the links between resource extraction, corruption, and conflict across the country. We started in forestry and more recently have focused on jade and gemstone mining. Actually, next week, we'll be publishing a significant report on rare earth mining in northern Myanmar and its links to military-aligned militia. This has actually led us, even before the coup, to spend years thinking about how the Myanmar military funds itself and enriches its patronage networks. With that in mind, with that background in mind, today I'm going to talk about sanctions, financial but also political, and how the international community can utilize sanctions to reduce the junta's access to money and limit its legitimacy. I'll start with the US and then broaden my comments to encompass what ASEAN and its member states can do. For the US, there is one clear policy that it has yet to pursue: sanctions on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, or MOGE. These sanctions would target the military junta's largest source of foreign currency, money it desperately needs to purchase the weapons, surveillance technology, and fighter jet fuel it requires to support its ongoing campaign of repression against the people of Myanmar. MOGE sanctions would also fulfill a long-standing request from Myanmar civil society and even the National Unity Government, while also acknowledging the leadership already shown by the European Union, which led the way by sanctioning MOGE back in February of this year. Okay, with that being said, let me step back and cover 2 points. First, I'd like to talk a little bit more about sanctions targeting and what the US and international community can and should be doing. And second, I'd like to talk about what ASEAN and member states can be doing. Financial sanctions on the military junta can be broadly placed into 4 categories, and policymakers must consider where they can make the most impact when considering what sanctions to use. 1, there's sanctions on junta officials and their families. 2, there's sanctions restricting access to specific products and services. 3, there's sanctions on so-called cronies and business enablers of the junta. And 4, there's sanctions targeting the junta's sources of financing directly. In the first category, sanctions on junta officials, the US and the EU, Canada, and UK have actually been relatively thorough in their efforts. The US has sanctioned broad swaths of the SAC leadership, as well as other officials involved in supporting the coup. These sanctions are good, as they send a strong message of condemnation of the junta's activities, but we should be clear-eyed about the actual and immediate impact these sanctions will have on the junta's decision-making and its operational capabilities. Few junta officials have large stashes of cash in Western banks, and Min Aung Hlaing himself was not big on the London property market even before the coup. Russian oligarchs, these are not. So while these sanctions are important, their immediate impact is relatively limited. Second are the restrictions on access to specific goods and services. For example, many individual countries around the world have banned the sale of arms and dual-use technology to the junta, an incredibly important action that has dramatically limited the junta's access to many technologies and to weapons. Unfortunately, more is needed at the international level, not the individual state level. I know this committee has already heard from Special Rapporteur Tom Andrews on this point, so I have little to add beyond his excellent testimony, beyond emphasizing the importance of robust enforcement of existing export restrictions, as well as the need to push for more international action at the UN level. The third category includes the cronies and business enablers who act as cutouts for the junta, helping them to purchase the restricted products just discussed and to move money in and out of the country. There's been some work done here, and we've seen sanctions against individuals and companies accused of facilitating arms purchases for the junta, for example. Again, as important as these sanctions are, though, their efficacy is limited by the difficulty of identifying these individuals, the ease with which companies can change registration and hide their beneficial ownership, and most importantly, by the resources that countries dedicate to sanctions, the limited resources that countries dedicate to sanctions investigations and enforcement. That leaves us with the fourth category, sanctions targeting junta financing, where there is the most scope for impact, especially in the case of US sanctions. Sanctions are at their most effective when they target entities and revenues with significant exposure to the international financial system, especially where payments are made through transparent and legal means. It's even better if foreign companies are heavily involved, and best if there's only a small number of them. This actually describes Myanmar's offshore gas industry perfectly. There are only a few companies involved in producing gas. Payments are made exclusively through large international banks in either euros or US dollars. It's a staggering amount of money. Prior to the coup, Myanmar's government earned up to $1.5 billion in revenues annually from oil and gas. This is now the single largest source of foreign currency for the junta and makes up to half of its foreign income. Given the global increase in gas prices, as well as Total Energy's extremely disappointing decision to gift shares in a large gas field to the junta as it withdrew from the country, this number may have actually increased since the coup. It's true that the EU has already put in place sanctions on Mlge, but due to the specifics of how the international financial system is constructed, US sanctions remain necessary, and they're needed to force banks to block payments from going to Mlge. I think most importantly, with thinking about Mlge sanctions, the humanitarian costs of US sanctions would likely be minimal, and this is something I'm happy to discuss in more depth during questions. Instead, the US has targeted industries, the gemstone, pearl, and timber industries most prominently, that are marked by opacity, illicit revenue flows, and high levels of smuggling that seriously limit the impact of such sanctions, which again, I am happy to talk about in more depth during questions. It's a truly baffling decision, and one that undermines US sanction policies in other areas by leaving the junta with access to its most significant revenue stream. Imagine if the international community, in efforts to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, chose to completely ignore the Russian oil and gas industry. It would be absurd.
We lost a little bit you, or maybe I lost you. There seems to be a difficult connection, so let's see if this can work out.
Okay, can you hear me now? I think, yeah, can other people hear me? See, Oliver.
I can hear you. I can hear you okay.
Yeah, probably it was my problem, but now I also hear you, so please continue.
Okay, great. So I'll step back just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if the international community, in efforts to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, chose to completely ignore the Russian oil and gas industry. It would be absurd. Any effort to target Russian revenues that did not address oil and gas would be considered non-serious. And yet, this is where we are at with US policy in Myanmar today. Sanctions on Mlge should be considered the bare minimum. Now, the sanctions on Mlge are not the only thing the US should be doing. And aside from Mlge sanctions, I'd like to talk about three other things that the US should focus on. Number one is increasing funding for Myanmar dedicated investigative and enforcement capabilities within the Treasury Department. This committee has heard from past presenters how difficult it is to trace money leaving the country, and no one really knows where the generals keep their ill-gotten wealth. But we could. The US has dedicated immense resources to tracking the financial flows of other illegal and violent organizations, such as the financial flows that sustain Al-Qaeda or ISIS or large drug cartels. The US should treat the junta the same in terms of its investigative priorities. Number two, and this applies to the US and other countries as well, is that it's important to engage in sanctions enforcement action publicly. There have been high-profile reports of Myanmar timber, for example, being purchased internationally in the US and EU, but no high-profile sanctions enforcement actions or criminal investigations announced. This gives the impression that the US and other Western countries are not serious about sanctions enforcement and invites entities to violate them. Public action would deter this. And the third thing that the US should focus on is increased cooperation in financial investigations with ASEAN and member states. Much like I have argued that the US needs to increase funding for its investigative capabilities, ASEAN members should as well. This applies especially to Singapore, the portal through which so much of the money into and out of Myanmar flows. Cooperation needs to be scaled up and extended to include other countries. Now, this is a perfect segue into what ASEAN can do. And I know that ASEAN member states are highly unlikely to place economic sanctions on members of the junta or on companies funding the junta. This isn't what member states in ASEAN do normally. But sanctions can be non-financial as well. And we've seen ASEAN utilize political sanctions broadly. We should take a broad definition of sanctions that recognizes this importance of political sanctions, which can be crucial in limiting the junta's legitimacy as well. I highlight three for ASEAN. Number one is travel bans. Members of the SAC may not travel often to New York or London, but they do like to travel within ASEAN. ASEAN member states should put in place travel bans for any and all SAC officials. Number two, defense cooperation. No countries should be engaging in any form of defense cooperation with the military junta, and I'll also include non-ASEAN Japan here, as this is a key point. The Japanese decision to accept Tatmadaw soldiers at its National Defense Academy is truly beyond the pale. It should go without saying that countries should not be engaging in defense cooperation with a military that has been credibly accused of literal genocide and that has spent the past year and a half murdering thousands of civilians while running Myanmar's economy into the ground. And yet here we are. Number three is junta participation at ASEAN events. It is extremely commendable that ASEAN has excluded Min Aung Hlaing from ASEAN leadership summits, but the junta still sends representatives to lower level events. ASEAN should immediately disinvite junta participants, including so-called non-political ones, from all of ASEAN events moving forward. At the very least, ASEAN should include equal representation from pro-democracy forces from within the National Unity Government or National Unity Consultative Council. It should again go without saying that the junta is not the government of Myanmar, yet ASEAN continues to treat it as such for some official purposes. Political sanctions may seem like a step apart from financial restrictions, but actually they should not be treated separately. Financial sanctions on their own will not make the difference in Myanmar. They are most effective when paired with decisive political action. Likewise, political actions gain a boost from effective financial pressure, demonstrating the importance of considering all of these policies together. The executions last week are a depressing reminder that the international response has thus far been entirely insufficient. I urge this inquiry to add its voice to the many others, recognizing that more is needed and to call for the international community to take more decisive action. Thank you for your consideration, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Keel. This was highly appreciated in terms of how we can encourage stopping the money flows in and out that favor the junta. So while waiting for colleagues to ask for the floor, I will, okay, let's start with Nitipon this time. So Nitipon, our colleague from Thailand. Nitipon, please.
Right. Thank you so much, Keel, for your very good and also interesting presentation. So, according to what you highlight, the point that you're talking about banning product from Myanmar. I mean, in Southeast, and most of people in Southeast Asia, that we believe in something, in some product that bring luck to people. For example, jade. You know, right? Yeah. And I saw some picture of my friend that they went to Myanmar, I mean, long time ago, and they saw like mountain or a big jade. Yeah, and I knew that, I mean, that Myanmar export that jade to, for example, China or any other countries. So so my question is, what is the best way to handle with this issue? That because I mean, in this issue we have to dealing with what the Southeast people believe, right? So this is my question.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question and speaks to a lot of the research that Global Witness has been working on over the past years. I would say, in particular with the jade industry, it's extremely difficult to address internationally. Over 90% of the jade that's mined in Myanmar is actually smuggled into China without ever entering the formal trade system. And then almost all jade is then sold locally within China itself. China is the single largest market for jade products. Unless China, well, so as we've heard, unless China becomes much more willing to crack down on smuggling along the border and more interested in halting flows of jade across its border, it will be very difficult to reduce jade revenues from going back to the military and its allies. That being said, I do want to highlight one thing about, well, actually one other thing. The situation is a little bit different with rubies. Myanmar is also one of the largest producers of rubies in the world. Unlike jade, where jade is mostly smuggled into China, much of Myanmar's rubies are smuggled into Thailand, which remains the largest ruby processing center in the world. I think there's certainly opportunities for the Thai government to do a better job of cracking down on illegal smuggling across borders. I would also say for the international community more broadly, it's extremely important that governments require higher standards of due diligence about country of origin rules around things like rubies. It should not solely be on the Thai government to crack down on smuggling. It should also be on the international community more broadly to enforce supply chain due diligence rules. Countries should not be purchasing Burmese jade or Burmese rubies right now. There has not been legal mining of jade or rubies in Myanmar for years now. Even before the coup, all mining permits had run out. So I would say that's one thing. I would like to make an important point though about what we're talking about in terms of monetary amounts here. The jade industry, the ruby industry is relatively small. The jade industry is quite large. But that being said, when we're looking at military financing, we need to distinguish between financing of the military as an institution. These are the things that allow the military to operate as a military on the one hand, and from this there's significant revenues. This is where oil and gas revenues going to the government make a huge difference. On the other hand, we have financing of the military in terms of enriching of individual officers and patronage networks, maintenance of patronage networks. And this is where jade and rubies play a much larger role. Jade is a significant source of income for individual officers and for the patronage networks that help sustain military's power, especially in ethnic minority regions. The military has a long history of co-opting ethnic militias by offering them resource rights in their kind of controlled territories. So when we're thinking about cracking down, like what would it mean to crack down on jade revenues? This is extremely important in the long run and extremely important for disrupting the military's patronage networks. But if we're thinking about what actually funds the military's operational capabilities right now, jade is not the big game. This is the oil and gas industry and the offshore gas. Yeah, so thank you for your question. I hope that answered what I hope that gave you a good answer.
Thank you. Now a couple of questions about the sanctions. Is there a reason why the US has not yet sanctioned the Mlge? As you mentioned, the EU has done that, and so you also mentioned that well, actually, perhaps you did not mention it, but I'd like to ask anyway. You have been involved in drafting the Burma Act in the United States. Why is this bill important? What does it aim to achieve? And is it the model for other regions? Then I'm sorry, I have many questions, two more. What are the least likely sanctions to cause unintended harm to people of Myanmar? I have a special aspect to this question, which is that the EU is discussing for some time now whether to suspend or not what we call the everything but arms trade benefits. And I'm very involved with this question. And so far, I have got the impression that none of that money flows into the treasury of the junta. Do you know something about this? Then you also mentioned the due diligence issue. You must be aware that at least the EU is busy at the moment drafting a law in this respect. Do you see that there would be other regions, other countries that are also doing the same? Because that, of course, could tighten up the market of these harmful products. And so many questions. I hope you made some sense of my questions, and please try to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Those are all very important questions. I actually can talk about two of them right away: the least likely sanctions to cause harm and the reason the US has not sanctioned Mlge. I'll handle that one first, because I think this is a really important question. I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons, broadly speaking, that the US has not yet sanctioned Mlge. The main one is concern about humanitarian impacts. What I would call maybe misguided concern about humanitarian impacts. And that's because I actually think that Mlge sanctions are one of the least likely sanctions to cause broader harm. First of all, the oil and gas industry does not employ very many people in Myanmar. But I'd like to make three kind of larger, broader points about the humanitarian impacts of Mlge sanctions. The first is around what Mlge sanctions would do, and I just want to be really clear. The international community's ask and the ask from the NUG, the ask from Myanmar civil society, and the ask from campaign organizations like Global Witness is not to shut down the gas industry. What we're asking is for US sanctions that would block the payment of revenues from purchasers going to Mlge specifically. And so within that context, I think the first thing that's really important to note is that I do not believe that US sanctions would lead to a shutdown of gas production. There's no reason it would need to. This would entirely be a decision by the military junta to respond to US sanctions by shutting down gas production. And there's four reasons why I don't think that's the case, or why I think that's the case. One, gas fields do provide some domestic supplies, especially to the industrial base around Yangon. So if the military junta were to halt production of gas, this would have an adverse impact on one of its key domestic political constituencies, the business people that provide a production and tax base for the regime. Halting domestic supplies would undermine the junta's claims to legitimacy and stoke anti-junta sentiment. Number two is that the relationship with both China and Thailand, the primary importers of Myanmar gas, it's too important for the junta to antagonize either by simply cutting off gas supplies. Number three, the junta will certainly is just pure greed. The junta will desire to gain access to this money in the future. If US sanctions are put in place and can divert money into escrow-like accounts, the junta will hope that removal of sanctions at some point in the future will allow it to access this money. Shutting down production and exports would prevent the junta from ever collecting these funds because they would not accumulate during the course of sanctions. And then the fourth reason is precedent. After the EU put sanctions in place, the junta did not shut down production, even though contacts within both the domestic gas industry in Myanmar and within the NUG have confirmed that at least for one of the gas field projects, payments were halted by the relevant bank for quite some time. And so the EU sanctions on their own did have at least an immediate impact in this way. And the junta did not respond by shutting down production. Now, undoubtedly, this is because they hope to get around sanctions in some way. But the fact remains that they simply didn't. So first, so that's the first point, is I would very much reject the premise that sanctions would lead to a shutdown in gas production. And if gas production is not shut down, there would be almost no humanitarian impacts. The second point is that even if gas production was shut down, the humanitarian impacts, while real in some ways, would be relatively limited. Thailand is the major importer of Myanmar gas, and the Thai electrical grid currently has significant excess capacity. Along with, it may force Thailand to tap into some of its reserves and to utilize emergency fuel oil in order to cover production for a few days or for a brief amount of time. But in the medium to long term, a shutdown of Myanmar gas supplies to Thailand would only result in slight increases in gas prices, not blackouts or brownouts. And then the third reason I think to consider is that sanctions on the decision not to place sanctions on Mlge is not a value neutral one. This money, the foreign currency that the junta gains from access to this money, has serious negative consequences for the people of Myanmar, far beyond what might happen were gas supplies to Yangon to be shut down, for example. The junta uses this money to purchase arms, to purchase surveillance technology, to purchase the jet fuel that it needs to fuel its fighter jets. Without access to this money, its operational capabilities would be hampered. So I think that's a key point that I want to make about Mlge sanctions. To answer a few of your other questions, especially around EBA, I personally believe that revoking EBA approval would be a mistake. That everything but arms approval by the EU would be a mistake. My understanding is that much of the EBA investment goes into the garment industry, which while it does pay taxes to the military junta, is in general not directly controlled by them. So the gains to the junta are relatively small compared to the significant employment that the garment industry provides to the people of Myanmar. A couple other questions, to your other questions on the Burma Act. I think the Burma Act does a few key things. I mean, first of all, it signals to the world that the US remains serious about and committed to addressing the situation in Myanmar. Within the Burma Act itself, there's a few things that it does. One, it strengthens and codifies in law sanctions authorities. So it would allow, it basically would give the Biden administration more flexibility in applying sanctions. Number two, it provides hundreds of millions of dollars in it authorizes hundreds of millions of US dollars in support for Myanmar civil society, for Myanmar media that's still able to operate either mostly outside of the country at this point, and for humanitarian needs and access as well. And three, it addresses the military's impunity by calling on the US to better support international justice initiatives, like some of the ones we just heard from Nicolas from the IIMM. And it also calls on the US to better respond to the determination earlier this year by the Biden administration to call what happened with the Rohingya a genocide. So I think that's what the Burma Act does overall. I'm hoping that it can be passed by the end of this year. And then to your last question on the due diligence issue and whether other regions are doing the same. I mean, some region, I think the EU's work is welcome, and I would actually have to defer to some of my other global witness colleagues who are more directly involved in actually helping the EU craft some of those due diligence rules. But I am not going to go into too much detail in this question. I apologize, but we can follow up. The question is an extremely important one, and it's something that countries around the world should be taking on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I've enjoyed excellent cooperation with your global witness colleagues on the due diligence legislation.